Happy Friday, everyone. So we made it to our first Friday, only 14 more to go. And so, yeah, countdown is on. We're going to be talking. It's not going to be our normal fun Friday. Normally, our Fridays are going to be doing quizzes. I mean, hooray quizzes. And then we're also going to have our data analysis activities, but we're not quite there yet. We'll start that next week. Today, we're going to have I'm going to use the term exciting in quotation marks, an exhilarating discussion of IT governance. And so I already warned you these first 5 weeks are going to be a little bit dry. I do think they're very important. That doesn't make it any easier to try to learn about them because their lack of exciting content. It doesn't make it easier to talk about them either. I will do my best to kind of make it engaging, enthusiastic, but if you thought audit was bad, sometimes this stuff gets really, really tedious. So we're going to try to keep it at a conceptual level and not to get too bogged down in the details. Just a note. So before we get started, let's go ahead and reflect on something that we talked about on Wednesday, or a couple of things we talked about on Wednesday. So I noticed that most of you have filled out the graduate student survey. And for those of you who have, thank you. If you've not yet done so, please make sure you do so at your earliest convenience. Again, this information will be kept confidential, but it's really important for planning purposes for our program. And it's also going to be helpful for those of you who have needs and issues. Particularly if you're looking for a placement, we will go out of our way to try to make sure that we get you all possible networking opportunities. I can say firsthand that in our program last year, we had, I think, 3 of the people who were joining the MAC program did not have job placements. And 2 of those people, we found job placements over the course of the year through this process. And then the only reason the one person didn't is because that person was very, very specific that they did not want to go to public accounting and they only wanted to go into one specific city in the United States. And it was not even a really big city either. So that was a bit of a challenge. And that person, I believe, is still looking for work. But given the constraints that we were under, we can't be blamed for that. Okay. Can't be blamed for that particular one. All right. So that's going to be important to make sure you reach out and let us know about that, and we'll do everything we can. It's also just good for articulation purposes. And then I said a reminder yesterday during our meeting that I'll remind you again today, but we're still taking applications for the Graduate Council Student Representative. Again, if you do that, being part of this course, you will get an extra credit boon from doing that, but you should just do it just because you want to represent the program in the Graduate Council. We do value the student input and the student responsiveness. And so I'd like to continue that tradition rolling, but the extra points don't hurt. So let's be all honest what we're in it for, okay? Let's be all honest what we're in it for. All right, today we're starting out with our discussion of IT governance. Now, we did talk a little bit about IT governance back in 367. It was not something that we focused or we anchored on very heavily, but we did talk about it at a very basic level. In fact, some of the things that we talked about, I think Michael pointed out during the work on Wednesday, says, haven't we looked at that stuff before? And the answer was yes, good memory. We did talk about some of this stuff before. We're going to do a much deeper dive. The way that I think about this is what we talked about back in accounting information systems at the undergraduate level was we were talking about more detail-oriented information, and we're going to be talking about strategic level information here. So it's basically going to be beyond or just at the organization level or even possibly higher. So beyond what we're talking about. Now, I'm going to kind of tackle this first definition. Everybody had to define it, and there's a lot of different aspects to it. I'm going to say this first question will probably take up, if not 20 minutes more time than we're going to be talking about. So obviously, the definition of IT governance, I think, is really important. Even though it's only 3 words define IT governance, actually, I guess 2 words and 2 initials. This is probably the most important question that we're going to be talking about today. So depending on the resource that you looked at, you are going to have many various definitions of IT governance. And I want to talk about a very basic definition, and then we're going to scrutinize that definition. So here's the definition that I kind of have. I believe this is from the CIO Wiki, although I may have rephrased it slightly. IT governance, which obviously we're talking about information technology governance, is a process used to monitor and control information technology capable decisions in an attempt to assure the delivery of value to key stakeholders in an organization. Now, first thing I'm going to talk about is everybody's definition fairly consistent with that definition. Some of you may have it almost verbatim, but is it fairly consistent with that? All right. So there are a couple of important points that I want to bring out in this particular definition. And we're going to start with the biggest one first. All right. The last few words that I said were to ensure the delivery of value to key stakeholders in an organization. Now, that V word, have you heard that V word before? Obviously, a silly definition, but heard that value word before? Yeah, obviously it's something that comes up a lot when we talk about the nature of accounting and business. But I do want to focus a little bit on this concept because it's a little bit deceptive. And the reason why is because this goes back to when I first started teaching this particular topic in this course. This is not going back all the way to the beginning of the course, but I changed the course pretty substantially about, I want to say 5 years ago. And this is one of the earliest questions that I came up with respect to IT governance. Had to do with this idea of delivering value. Now, if I were to ask you, let's just try to wipe your slate clean and not even look at the definitions you have in front of you. And I want you to think, if I were to ask you from this context, say, define AT governance, and you had to come up with a definition on your own, not using internet resources, not using AI, not using search, just your own existing set of knowledge, would the term value have been included in that definition? Probably not. Probably not. There probably would have been another word that was included in the definition. I know that there was when I started brainstorming about this, when I looked at it, there was another word. It's a four-letter word. It starts with letter R. It's the same name as a board game. Anybody know what word I'm talking about? Risk. Okay, risk or security. All of those concepts ingrained in there. So that was kind of a surprise to me when I first came to the definitions is where's the term risk? Where's the term security? Why is that incorporated in there? And why would we not include this in value? And I've done a lot of brainstorming about this, and I've talked about it from many different perspectives. And we're going to expand upon this definition because this definition is really, really critical. But part of the reason I think has to do with this sequence that we've discussed accounting in your curriculum. All right. So when you first started out, you took accounting 220 and 221. You had some exposure to risk, but for the most part, you were kind of told that the whole goal here is to provide value to the owners, is to explain how value delivery was occurring within the organization. So value was probably a paramount focus back when you were just learning accounting. Can we say that's correct? Then you started taking more complex and nuanced topics. You started taking your intermediate accounting courses. You took cost accounting, took AIS, took auditing and tax. And then this concept of risk started peeking its head out because it was the idea that risk is also really important. So let's hold on to that, but we're gonna talk about value with respect to risk here in just a little bit. But does that mean that value goes away, that we can't consider value and risk together? No, it just means that we assume that you already have this idea of value absorbed. So now we need to talk about risk with respect to value. So we've had this focus on risk. We had this big anchoring that occurred at the end of your undergraduate studies, and you talked about, all right, risk is really important, security is really, really important. But is security even relevant if we don't have value? No. And we actually talked a little bit about that with respect to how it works in financial accounting. Everybody remember our discussion on Wednesday where I put up the slide, the statements on financial accounting concepts number 8, and I said, what was the most important thing that we had to consider from that slide with respect to this topic? And it was the constraint. What was that constraint? Cost, yes. Specifically, the benefit from any accounting information or accounting information system that we derive has to exceed its cost. It makes no sense to actually incorporate a system if we don't have if that the value derived from that system does not exceed its cost. I've actually got a YouTube video which I don't know that I'm going to show here, but it talks a little anecdote. We'll get to that when we start talking a little bit later in our answers, and we go through kind of the individual later answers, because that relates to one of the things we're going to talk about. But we do know that value is really important, and I'd say it's the most important item that we're going to talk about with respect to IT governance. Now, we're not going to leave that as a whole. We're not going to say value at all costs, because there are some really, really important caveats to that. And two of them very, very in particular that you need to remember. One of those obviously being risk/security, but there's also going to be another one that we're going to have to talk a little bit about. So let's go ahead and then drill down a little bit more. So I do want to repeat the last part of that definition. So it says to ensure the delivery of value to key stakeholders in an organization. What's a stakeholder? Somebody who's holding a stake, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Is that too old a reference? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's a little bit dated. Sorry. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. Anyway, yeah. So is a stakeholder the same thing as a stockholder? No. Okay. Can you be a stakeholder and a stockholder? Okay. Is it possible to be a stakeholder without being a stockholder? Yes. So stockholders are owners of organizations, people who legitimately hold stock. Okay. But stakeholder by definition is anybody who has a stake in the organization. So that can be owners. Okay. Can be somebody who's got an interest in the organization, but somebody who is also a stakeholder might be customers, employees, vendors, governmental agencies. You say, what governmental agencies, Dr. Barnes? And say, well, the IRS is probably a big one. Yeah, they have a stake in it. If they don't get their tax money, then they're probably going to come do an audit. I say that, and I say the IRS is so incredibly underfunded right now. Maybe they won't. Okay, that is not trying to let you guys know it's okay to commit tax evasion. Not a good idea. All right, I'm not trying to promote that. I'm just saying that the IRS is so woefully underfunded right now. Anyway, stakeholders are really, really important. We have to actually support the interest of stakeholders, which means that we have a litany of interests that we have to understand. Remember, as you talked about in other courses, there may be differing interests for key stakeholders. Different stakeholders may want different things. So we're trying to maximize value according to what stakeholder interests are. And that's not our second component, by the way. I just want to make sure that everybody understands what stakeholders is. It's a broad encompassing term. It's not just limited to the owners of organization. As much as Boeing and Enron might want to define that as just being it, it's not just the owners of the organization. I don't know why I chose to pick on Boeing. They're a Truman sponsor. Yeah, but they're notorious. They're notorious for maximizing stakeholder value at other costs. So I don't know. Some Boeing representative that supports Truman is going to watch this video and says, We're cutting all support, cutting all support." You got to take the good with the bad. You got to take the good with the bad. Boeing's done a lot of great things. They've also done some not so great things. So it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off. All right, let's go to a little bit more definition. Say the objective of IT governance is to ensure the delivery of business results, not IT systems performance, nor IT risk management. So it's basically telling us it's not going to be risk. Risk is not the focus here. It's much more broad than that. That would reinforce the notion of IT as an end of itself. To the contrary, IT governance is about decisions that have an impact on business value. There's that terminology right there. Now, that definition is a little bit more specific in its notions, but I do want to talk a little bit about how that is represented here. So it says not systems performance, not IT risk management. It's not an end of itself. It's more about generating business value and what are the decisions that relate to generating business value. So I've got kind of a semi-rhetorical question here. It actually does have a correct answer, but it's something you probably haven't thought about. So does this mean that IT governance can have conflicting roles, particularly with respect to information security? And you may say, well, I don't know. You probably asked that question for a reason. So it's probably a yes. And the answer is yes. I probably wouldn't ask the question otherwise. Can have conflicting roles. But what does that mean? Well, the question then comes up is it possible to have a focus on risk that is not necessarily a focus on value, or vice versa? Can you have a focus on value without a focus on risk? Yeah, absolutely. You can make decisions that are contrary to one or the other. All right. We already talked about an example where you go out and you buy a control that would mitigate a high part of risk, but really, really violates value. You say $1 million control to stop a $1,000 misstatement. That violates the value principle, but it definitely will impose a risk assessment. It will reduce risk. It'll mitigate risk. Is the other possible? Can you focus on value without focusing on risk? All right, story time. All right, story time. Here we go. By the way, I know that I've had you all in multiple classes. Some of you, by the time this is all done, will have me for 5 classes. You will hear my stories repeat themselves, okay? Now, I don't want you to tell me in the middle of the story, we've heard the story before, Dr. Barnes, okay? Unless I've done it like 5 times, then that's probably all bets are off, okay? I don't think I've told this story to anybody. If I have, just nod and enjoy the story, okay? My tales are worth repeating. They're that good, all right? So, does anybody know what I used to do whenever I told you all how I approached my PhD research, because when we did PhD research for our seminars, we had to read these massive papers, like 50-page papers, and we had to do like 3 or 4 of them a week, sometimes 5 a week. And this is not like reading a book where you're just kind of like, oh my, this is fun reading. This is like in-depth drudgery research, the kind of things that like capstone papers, but far, far more complex and technical. So have I told you all what my process was for that? Because I'm very attention deficit. And so sitting down in the library and say, I'm going to spend the next 2 hours focusing on reading this, and I'm going to do that every single day this week. That did not work for me. Okay. It's not something I was capable of. Well, my process is that I need to have something to kind of occupy my attention. And then basically when I was in the occupation of that attention, I would focus on the PhD research. So I needed something that would leave me large gaps of time, but I would want to be doing some other activity. And I found it. It worked out. It was Texas Hold'em. All right. I played cards. And I want to say that I'm a good Hold'em player, but I'm not. I'm actually a pretty poor Hold'em player. The thing is the people I was playing were just worse than I was. So I was actually generating value as part of that. Now, this is not the value generation aspect. That's actually the longer part of the story. So what I would do is I would go to the casino like on Friday and Saturday nights when the weekends hit, and I would sit there for like 6 and 7 hours, like get there at 8 and go to like 2 a.m. in the morning, and I would just play. But if you've ever done Texas Hold'em, it's a lot of just basically folding over and over again and doing nothing, and then sometimes you get a little action, like maybe 2 or 3 times an hour. And I love playing Texas Hold'em, but I was like, what do I do in the meantime? PhD research. All right. Research reading. I'd basically be there with my iPad, or before that, I would be there with the papers and I'd be highlighting them. All right. So that's divert my attention. Now, how is that relevant here? It's not. I just wanted to explain my fascination for Texas Hold'em. This is the part of the story. Okay. So back in 2021, I won an award for a piece of research that I did. And so I had to go to Las Vegas. Now you see where this is going. Okay. So Las Vegas. Now, I was at Las Vegas and I was on Saturday, and Saturday we're supposed to go to more research sessions. And I'm like, I'm in Las Vegas. I'm not going to come back home for my research to say, how'd you have fun? How'd you do in Las Vegas? And I said, well, I sat in conference sessions the entire time. I absolutely refused to do that. So I went out on the strip. And this is during the middle when things were starting to unlock for the pandemic, but not fully unlocked. So I was still wearing my face mask. But I planned on doing nothing, but I walked down the entire strip and walked back, and I had a lobster roll, which was a great lobster roll, by the way, one of the best I've ever had. It was $50, but it was still a very good lobster roll. And then I said, I'm going to play some Hold'em just for about an hour. Well, I had a really good run, and I was up like $100 after that hour. All right. So I decided that I was going to do something that I promised I would not ever do again, because I had gone to Las Vegas many times during when I was at KPMG and when I was in my PhD program, because I have friends that live out there, still do, but I would usually go there a couple times a year, and every single time I'd go, I'd put $20 on 28 black. Now you're saying, why would you do something that's so silly, Dr. Barnes? The answer is I would do it for my brother. Because my brother had this inane notion that if you put $20 on 28 black, you're going to win. I had done it about a dozen times before and never won. All right. So I was up $100 and I said, okay, one more for one time's sake. Then I hit. It hit. All right. Like I was down, I like put in $100. I got the additional $200, put 20 of that in, and then I was up $700. All right. So is that a value proposition? Absolutely. Okay. Is that something that I would sit there and I would tell you that you all should do? I said, no, don't do this. All right. I know that even though I won that particular bout, that was not a value generating proposition. Am I up in the long run? Well, if I continue doing it, no, I will be down in the long run. I know that the way that the expected value works, and that was not a positive expected value of our proposition, but it is a value proposition if you ignore the risk associated with that. So that's kind of a fun story. And of course, I told my brother that, and he had two responses with that. So he once said, 28 black always wins, okay? When demonstrably it does not always win, okay? It won 1 out of 13 tries, all right? Which is still actually better odds than you should normally get. And then 2, he wanted a cut of my profits. So, yeah. He took a lot of credit for it. See, I told you, it always happens. Always 1 out of 13 times. Yeah, there we go. Anyway. So we can't have value, or we can't have value without respect to risk. Well, it's really important that we understand that. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about this. Value and risk are integrated concepts. In fact, we're going to talk about this idea of risk optimized value. And that is value with respect to risk. Now, we're not going to look at mathematical models. I'm sure you probably could go to the math department. They'd say, oh, yeah, we can do risk optimization, and show you something with a whole lot of letters and no numbers in it. Talk about that. I just want to do this at a conceptual level, is that we need to think about value with respect to risk. That's the first characteristic we need to talk about. So the third definition we'll talk about, the objective of IT governance is not just the delivery of risk optimized business value, there's that term, but also to engender the trust of key stakeholders in the people which they exhausted their money and or livelihood. So that's another aspect to it. So this is our second part of the definition, is trust. All right. So do you think that it's possible that trust plays an important role in value in an organization as well? We talked about this concept in different frameworks. We've talked about the nature of transparency. Why do we insist upon transparency in organizations? So people outside the organization can see inside and see that it's doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they learn trust in the organization. Now, what happens if you don't have trust in an organization? Is it possible that you can do business and engage without trust? In the short term, yes. Okay. In the short term, that's certainly possible. In the long term, I'm not sure that's practical. let's think about an example. I'm going to use my brother as an example again because he worked for a restaurant company for several years. And so one of the problems of this organization, it was very poorly managed. And as a result, they ended up declaring bankruptcy. And so what they told them to do right before the bankruptcy was declared, it says, all right, we want you to go to your vendors and we want you to go ahead and make these large orders. Then we're going to declare bankruptcy and we're going to default on our payments to them. All right. Is that generating value in the short term? Yeah, absolutely. It's generating a lot of value in the short term because they're saying we're getting stuff for free. Is that going to generate value in the long term? What's going to happen with a vendor when you tell them that you're not going to pay them? At the very minimum, they're going to say, well, we're not going to do business with you in the future. In all likelihood, they're going to come back and say, all right, lawsuit. Okay. They're going to hire Professor Templeton and come after it with teeth bared. Yeah. So it's certainly important that trust is going to be a component of that. Now, are there other components of value that we're missing here? Probably. Okay. Probably. There's a lot going on with that. But these are the two that I want to focus on for this particular concept in this course, is that we do need to optimize risk, which is probably our most important aspect, but we also need to engender trust of stakeholders. So one can argue that trust results in more business value, no doubt. But the fact remains that it's a means to an end and must be recognized and implemented independently as a motivation for IT governance. So again, IT governance, not an end of itself, is trying to accomplish something. Okay, so it's maybe we can make the argument that it's trying to accomplish value. It's also trying to accomplish security and trust. And we're going to see those aspects when we break down the nature of IT governance here in just a little bit. But that's more really important to note. So in a sense, IT governance acts upon the old adage of trust but verify. How many people have heard that term before? Trust but verify. This is one of my favorite terms. All right. As the auditor, it probably makes sense. Okay. Probably makes sense. So what is the really important notes that we need to say here is that how does it translate for our purposes? Well, there's going to be a hierarchy. There's going to be a hierarchy in which we're thinking. Now, these are related concepts, but if we were to rank them, we'd probably say value is probably the highest one. I shouldn't say probably, it is the highest one in our hierarchy. It's the most important concept. The second one is going to be security. Okay, we cannot trust if we don't have security. It's basically saying, all right, I'm going to give you $100 and then I'll pay it back in a week. And you say that to somebody who you fully trust, then you're comfortable making that payment. If somebody says that to you, you make that statement before and never paid you back, then you're probably not going to take that risk another time. All right. So security, risk is going to be a second component, and then trust is at the bottom. Not saying trust is not important, but it's third in our hierarchy. So the IT Governance Institute, which is their terminology is ISACA, by the way, which that's actually a long story. They used to be called the Information Systems and Information Systems Audit a Computer Alliance or something like that. I remember I looked up the term right before class, and I always forget what it stands for. But the IT Governance Institute, which is again somehow called ISACA, it's really weird. They define IT governance as follows: leadership, organizational structures, and processes to ensure that organization IT sustains and extends the organization's strategies and objectives. All right, so it's important to note when we talk about how it relates to organization is that the structure itself has to be driven towards these concepts. That has to be driven towards value, has to be driven towards risk management, has to be driven towards trust. If any of those are missing, then it's unlikely this is going to be a successful endeavor. It's going to be a successful process. All right, now I'm going to start talking to you all. Like I said, their talk was going to talk about this. I said it was going to be about 20 minutes, so roughly there. I think I've gone into a lot more detail on that in the past, so be thankful that most of that was about a story that I told. Okay. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk to each of you all. So what are the three most widely recognized IT governance frameworks? And Max, you get to kick us off for this semester. You are the first and the foremost. All right. So what does your group identify as the three governance frameworks?
We have the ITIL, COVID, ISO 27.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So IT Infrastructure Library, which is also known as ITIL, control objectives for information related to technologies, which somehow translates as COBIT and not cohort. Yeah, COBIT. And then International Organizations for Standards 27,000 series. Okay, the 27,000 series. Now, by the way, we are going to talk about this more in detail. I want to make sure that we're clear on this. You probably saw this, they referred to 27,002. All right. On Monday next week, we're going to look and it's going to say 27,001. It says, why did the number change? The answer is they're all part of the same series. The reference actually refers to what particular document they're referring to within the series. 27,001, it relates to the requirements under the standard. 27,002 relates to the controls that are related to the standard. Okay. So For the most part, you don't need to know the difference between that. All you need to know is the ISO 27000 series and what it's broadly trying to accomplish. So if I ask this question on an exam, if you say 27001, that's fine. If you say 27002, that's fine. If you say 27000 series, that's fine too. All of those are interchangeable for our purposes. Now, are they interchangeable in reality? No, okay. You don't want to use 27001 when you need 27002, but we're not going to get that complex, not that granular. All right. According to the CIO Wiki, what are the 5 domains for IT governance? Okay. Let's go ahead and move on to Ethan. What's your group identify for this one?
We said strategic alignment, value delivery, performance management, risk management.
Yes. All right. So I identified those same ones. That was so good. I'm going to ask you question number 4. All right. What was question number 4? What's your answer to that one?
This is one of the upper one, but I think that's the same thing.
Okay, all right. I had confidence in you being able to handle the difficulty of those questions. So exactly the same thing. By the way, part of the reason for this is that when we first started doing this question, again, it's like 5-6 years ago, the question order was slightly different, and I wanted to actually go into detail about that. And the publications have been revised and adapted to where they actually present them in this order. So the question still comes, does the order matter? And I think the answer initially was we didn't know. But I think the answer now is it does represent some sort of sequence, some sort of framework. Now we're going to get more into detail on that. Okay. We're going to get more into detail on that. But I was not being redundant just for the sake of being redundant. It was just like, you know what? I really want to have 10 questions. Let me just repeat a question. I did want to make sure that the resources were consistent with one another. And I think there's some consistency being achieved where this was not always the case. All right. So this moves on to our group questions. Now, you probably noticed for the individual questions or group questions, the individual questions are usually more fact-based. They're not always going to be the case. I may ask you your opinion on some of the individual questions, but for the most part, they're going to be kind of task-oriented, whereas the group questions are more discussion or opinion-based. Now, that's not always going to be the case either. You may have to look up information for the group questions, but there's going to be a lot of assessment being made here. So what is the difference between IT governance and corporate governance? Now, this is kind of splitting the difference, is that there's a way that you could think about this that's both value-based and there's also kind of definitional-based. But I kind of want to break this down really quickly before we get onto the more nuanced information. So Josh, what does your group say for the difference between IT governance and corporate governance?
We said that IT governance is an element of corporate governance. IT governance focuses on managing and aligning information technology, performance, strategy, and risks with those overarching business goals. And corporate governance is kind of a broad system of rules, practices, processes by which an organization is controlled.
Good. Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for. So IT governance is basically a subset of corporate governance. And corporate governance, by definition, is something that we manage the entire organization. In fact, if you go to the CIO Wiki, you can find the page on corporate governance. There's a link to a separate page on corporate governance. If you click on it, it goes to enterprise governance. Now, are enterprise governance and corporate governance the same thing? Innately, yes, they're effectively the same thing. Could you make a little bit of a delineation distinction? Probably, but it's not really important. What is important for our purposes is that we need to know that IT governance is part of the overall corporate governance framework. Now, does this make sense? If you were to think about this without the documents, if I say, are IT governance and corporate governance the same thing? Would you have said, well, they're different words, Dr. Barnes, so probably not. Yeah, probably so. Okay. And how would you have made that distinction? You'd probably say, well, corporate governance probably deals with the entire organization. IT governance deals with the information technology employed by the organization. Now, does that mean that IT governance is narrow? No, because most organizations really can't exist without IT frameworks anymore. There might be a few organizations out there. Again, I'm going to point to my small organization example, Greek Corner Euros. I should probably stop using them as an example because I have not gone to eat there in like 2 or 3 years. They're wonderful human beings. It's just, my body can't handle the food anymore. It's like Taco Bell. Anyway, yeah. So, what's that? They're very, very good. They're very, very greasy. I mean, you don't go there without expecting the calorie count. Okay. I'll tell you right now. Yeah. At your age, you're probably fine with that when you still have a metabolism. I got a 54-year-old's metabolism. So yeah. Again, we're going off the rails here. So, this is the fun part of the class, Dr. Barnes. Keep going. Anyway, so yeah, with respect to smaller organizations, maybe you could say that they don't have an IT governance, or at least not a robust IT governance framework. But most organizations are going to say that's going to be an integral part of their organization. It's important. So there's probably a little bit less of a distinction than we'd like to say, but corporate governance is certainly more broad in that regard. All right, so let's move on to question number 6. how does IT governance relate to other governance areas in organization? Enterprise governance, product development governance, and or developmental governance, or yeah, developmental governance. All right, so let's go ahead and first of all define this, and then we're going to look at a diagram. So, Jacob, what does your group say on this one? Good, good. So basically relates to the organization as a whole, as do all the other components. They're all kind of part of the organizational governance, their enterprise governance framework. And there's actually a diagram a little bit later on here, which we're going to talk about. I do want to make a note here. I do like the CIO wiki, but I'm kind of hit or miss on the ads that come up here. Okay, so this one's one that's a new one to me, the generative AI and LLMs for dummies. I don't know what that's trying to say about me. Last year when I did this particular one, I was listening to the lecture from last year morning in preparation one, and last year apparently it had to do with health and fitness, like weight loss, and I thought that was a little bit rude. And then in previous years, I've actually gotten ads for Russian brides, which I honestly don't know where that came from. I promise you all, I have never actually looked for a Russian bride or anything resembling that online. I think they're just kind of saying he's a 50-something-year-old man is single. He's the perfect target demographic. Okay, this one's actually, whoops, pretty innocent compared to some of the other ones I've got. So this is just a warning. Some of these ones, when you do free resources, you get some really, really weird targeted marketing. So I'm guessing you guys probably didn't get generative AI and LMs for dummies, and I'm a little bit offended by that, to be honest. All right. So as we're talking about here, this diagram kind of illustrates this. This is an interesting one when we talk about this, and there's a couple of things to note. Is that when I look at this, I would assume that IT governance would first of all be much more broad than this. Now, I do think that there's a little bit of overlap that kind of explains this, is that it does have, is actually obviously part of the enterprise governance, which is the entire blue circle. So it's part of that, a component of that. And there's some overlap with product development governance. Now, my thought is that product development governance would be a circle within the IT governance, but is it possible that we could have some sort of aspects of product development within an organization that are not related to IT or are outside of the scope of IT? Yeah, I think that's what the implication is here. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. It's just more of an observation that it's not necessarily as broad as we're trying to give it credit for. The interesting thing is that development governance is a really, really small subset in here. And this is one that kind of eluded me for a very long time of why is development governance so small? I would assume that it would be broader than product development governance, because by definition, product development would be a subset of any development governance. But I think the answer to this one, and I'm not 100% sure on this one, which means that I'm not going to ask you an exam question on this, but I do think it's important to note. Development governance is more about development of the organization as a whole. So managerial responsibilities with the long-term strategy and planning of the organization. I think that's trying to imply, and it makes sense that it's a subset of all three of the things that we're talking about. Subset of enterprise governance, subset of IT governance, and a subset of product development governance. All right. Now we're going to get into some of the more important questions for respect to this course. So let's go ahead and take a look at question number 7. So I had you reload back to question number 2. What are the differences between the IT governance framework? So we've got ITIL, COBIT, and ISO 27000 series. So let's just go ahead and see what kind of answer you came up with as far as the definition, the distinction there. Drew, you're going to be responsible for this one. So what'd your group come up with? Right, good. Okay, so that's good definitions. Let's think about this in a nutshell, and we're going to talk a lot more about this next week, but I think it's important to define these parameters to start with. Now, if I were to say to you all, which one do you think is the most broad of all these frameworks? What do you guys think? The answer is probably, I don't know, Dr. Barnes. That's why we rely on you. That's why we're paying you our tuition, to tell you right there. But it is something that you need to note, all right? So let's look at the COBIT framework. What was the definition of the COBIT framework? The definition was strategy and objectives for IT resources. Now, is it possible to generate value without a strategy or a plan? Probably not. Okay. So one of the things that's most paramount is actually what is the objectives that we're trying to accomplish and how do we accomplish those? All right. Now, COBIT, or as we're going to see, is kind of our base underpinning. This is the one that gets implemented before all the others because it identifies what the issues are to achieving our strategy. The interesting part about that is it doesn't answer how to those problems, how to address those problems. It just says these are the problems, here are the problems in a list of orders. These are the ones you have to address, but it doesn't tell you specifically what to do. It's like the PCOB in that way. It can identify problems, but it doesn't provide any solutions. All right. Sorry for the audit callback. Anyway, that's something to note with respect to COBIT. Now, if we talk about ITIL and ISO 27000, they deal with more specific aspects, things that we've already talked about. Now, we talked about three components with respect to our value definition. The first component was obviously value. Second component was risk and security. Then we talked about trust. It's interesting that these three most important frameworks, two of them, the two that we're going to talk about, ITIL and ISO 27000 series, relate specifically to those two definitions. As Drew pointed out, ITIL is about IT service management, which is the generation of value for stakeholders. And then ISO 27000 series is about an IT security system, or ISMS, Information Security Management System. So information security. So we do have our big, true, important components, the top two components of value, which is value itself and security, being captured by these two frameworks. Again, we're going to get into more detail about what these represent. There is a document online that I think does a pretty nice job of talking about this. It's an objective look at all these. So it actually does delineate all of these items about COBIT, ITIL, and ISO 27000. But it also talks a little bit about NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technologies. You can ignore that for the time being, but we are going to talk about some NIST aspects a little bit later in the course. We're going to talk about the privacy framework, and we're also going to talk about cybersecurity framework. So that is something that we will actually be exposed to a little bit later in the course once we get more of our information under our belt. All right. So using the information from the above resources, prepare your own definition for each of the 5 domains of IT governance. All right. So domains of IT governance, we've got strategic alignment, value delivery, risk management, resource management, and performance measurement. So I've got several groups. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have each group provide one. So Tommy, I haven't talked to you yet. What did your group identify for strategic alignment? Okay. Do you think it's really important that this one is first? Yeah, it's probably the same reason why COBIT is kind of the first to be implemented. Is the idea is that if we don't know what we're doing, then we can't actually do it. I mean, at least not in practice, in practicality. It's possible that you could just go out and do random things and hope that it all works out, but that's generally not a good advisable strategy to take. Now, strategic management, pretty straightforward as far as what we need to note. Let's talk about value delivery, because I think that this is one of the ones that we need to have a little bit more drill down on. So value delivery, we're going back to Max. Max, what did your group say on this one?
We say value delivery, make sure that the value is achieved. That's what it figures out project and service value drivers, managing projects through their life.
All right. So how these investments derive value for the organization, basically, or how these initiatives drive value. Is that a fair assessment? Yeah. Now, what have we already said about value? Value obviously includes components with respect to risk, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Also contains a component of trust. But we know that this is probably the most important thing that an organization can accomplish. That being said, we do need to actually understand what value represents, what the cognizant representation of value is. And usually when we think about value, we're thinking about benefit minus cost. So benefit has to exceed cost, going back to SFAC number 8. So there's actually a video, and I don't think I left the video up. So it's a video here, the best practice for IT governance. The reason I'm bringing this slide up, or this screen capture up, because it does have definitions for all of these right here that are pretty worthwhile. But if you watch this video, the narrator talks about a situation where it was not him, but it was somebody else working at a small city. And it was a city of a staff of individuals, about 150 people. So they were trying to create a payroll system. Now, how does this compare to like the city of Kirksville? Anybody want to take a guess at what the size of the city of Kirksville, kind of the core government entity is? It's roughly 150 people. It's about the same size as the city of Kirksville. It was actually, I did a Google search early before I came to class, thinking ahead. City of Kirksville is about 140 people, so roughly in that ballpark. So we're talking about a small town, roughly the same size as Kirksville, responsible for the administration of about 17 to 20,000 people. Now, just a quick question. Assuming that you had all of the information in detail and you had a little bit of knowledge in that area, how would you develop a system for payroll for an organization? Do you think you could do something even just reasonably effective using an Excel spreadsheet? There might be some security issues, but yeah, I think I could track payroll pretty easily in Excel spreadsheets. You probably want to have a more specialized package, something like QuickBooks or something like NetSuite, but you could probably track payroll with a spreadsheet, or even just a simplified database for those of you who've got access experience. So payroll for 150 people, not that complicated, especially if you know the basics. The story talks about how they had somebody who was a former employee for IBM and said, what we need is a mainframe system. Now, has anybody ever heard the term mainframe before? All right, so a mainframe system is a gigantic computer that basically takes up a side of a wall. If I had a mainframe here, it'd be like from here to here and this tall, okay? It's a massive computing system. And obviously it's outdated in this day and age because we've got cloud-based systems. This is a little bit of an older video, but even if we're going back 10 years ago, that's still something that was not necessary for this situation. First of all, it's an outdated system. Secondly, it's completely and totally irrelevant for managing a payroll for 150 people. And the city actually bought the mainframe system because that's what they had the expertise in. Now, the cost of the system was $250,000, which is probably more than the IT system or the payroll system manages within a quarter. So certainly an issue with respect to benefit versus cost. So that benefit versus cost constraint, very, very practical to consider. And it's understandable why we would want to think about that, because that is what's going to drive our value distinction, our value definition. All right, risk management. Ethan, what'd your group come up with?
We used to safeguards implemented in the case of catastrophe to ensure recovery of system information as well as the encryption and storage of current operations.
Yeah, and I think that probably is just we don't necessarily need to say it's something as extreme catastrophe, but anything that represents a threat to the organization. And so, but yeah, risk management certainly one of those aspects that we've already talked about are really, really critical to define. Resource management. Josh, what'd your group come up with?
Resource management looked at how IT optimizes and manages critical IT resources. Some resources that are used are hardware and software, asset management, third-party providers, and outsourcing and standardized architecture.
Okay. I like the definition. What was that O word used near the beginning of your definition?
Optimizers.
So resource optimization, is that going to be the same thing as value optimization with respect to risk? Yeah, probably somewhere in the same ballpark. So it's just kind of a different way to think about this. So we think about value maximization or risk optimized value, however you want to term it. It kind of is the same concept, is that how do we best leverage our resources to manage the resource optimization or the value of the firm, to maximize the value of the firm. And then we have this thing called performance measurement. Okay, Jacob, what does performance measurement entail? So the governance is operating effectively with IT systems. And so what is an important component of performance measurement? So do we need to note that performance measurement has to be an ongoing process? Is that something that is probably an important characteristic of an organization? Could you measure performance at a point in time and be satisfied that it's always going to operate that way? Performance measurement has to be ongoing because circumstances change over time, and situations and risks change over time? Seems like we've heard that before. And again, this is going to be an auditing callback, but we've heard this concept that risks change over time, so things need to change over time. What is that an allusion to? So one of my favorite things to talk about. So obviously the COSO framework, okay, because I love talking about a COSO framework. Which component of the COSO framework? Monitoring, very good. Monitoring, yeah. So when risks change over time, it's something that we have to be able to adapt and change to. Performance measurement represents that same capacity, that same aspect of that. All right. Oops, keep doing that, and I don't mean to. So let's go ahead and take a look at how these relate to one another. So I ask you in the questions, I say, how do these domains relate to one another within an IT framework? And did most of you answer that it kind of is like this? Hopefully you did, because that's what I was directing you to in the question. I say, take a look at the service end piece and look at this. So if we kind of look at this and look at how this is represented, this is a little bit of less, a little bit more difficult distinction. But we talk about the strategic alignment, which is our first part, that leads to value delivery, risk management, performance management, and resource management is kind of overarching. And these are all drivers of stakeholder values, what that represents. Now, the question I have for you is this necessarily a sequential process? This is what this distinction seems to say. It's more of a cyclical process, but is it necessarily a cyclical process? I think this is a simplification. I think this is a very easy way to think about it, but I think you can say to some degree, some of the aspects are going to be sequential, but it's not necessarily cyclical in its nature. For example, if we were to go to risk management and do we need to adapt a strategy or adapt a strategy to address differing risks, that might be something that might be that we capture in performance management, but would need to be changed before we actually achieve that strategic alignment that we revise again. Or we could say strategic alignment, we've identified a need to change performance measures, even though we don't necessarily know that the risk is going to exist yet. So sequential process, I think innately it makes sense, but it's not necessarily constrained to being a sequential process. All right. But overall, I think this is a good characterization of that. I think that especially resource management falling outside of the scope of the other four aspects and being a supporting feature, a supporting characteristic is probably very, very important to remember. And all of these being related to one another, even if it's just indirectly, really important to note. So last question. In your own words, why is the IT governance important? All right. So I have got two more people to talk to. I'm going to have two different definitions, I'm hoping. All right. So Drew, what was your group's definition? Yes, so the IT has to support the overall objectives of the organization. Pretty much straightforward as that. If we don't have that alignment, then there's not going to be any way to achieve value or to manage risk. So certainly important to note. Tommy, the other Wilson in the class, so what does your group say there? By the way, that was just completely random. I didn't assign you as the last two just because you're both last names. Again, randomization, sometimes these things happen. I was just laughing about that when I was looking at the group names today. So anyway, what's the other one?
It's a very similar. IT governance is important management boundaries and optimizing the application of IT complexity and goals. And IT continues to play more significant role in all significant organizations reporting to governing schools can form one important. Without IT governance, it would be impossible for them to communicate differently and leverage schools.
Right. So if we don't have a plan in place for leveraging our IT resources, then we're not going to leverage those resources effectively. We'll not maximize value. We'll not manage risk. We will not engender the trust of stakeholders. So I know this stuff is a little bit dry and a little bit tedious, but can we all agree that IT governance is a critical aspect of resource management within an organization? If your answer is no to that question, then it's going to be a very rough time over the next few weeks for you. Okay. So it's our first baseline important step is going to be, we need to know that this is really, really important. This is really, really critical to develop an understanding for it, which is why we're spending the next few weeks talking about this, because if we don't have this in place, then an organization cannot survive. All right. That's it for this week. I'll see you again on Monday for more exciting IT governance.